In the dense silence of a judgment morning, the courtroom remains in a semi-darkness under controlled light. A police German shepherd, guided by its handler, stands motionless among the security guards. In the audience, a 3-year-old girl escapes from her mother and walks up to the dog. She touches the animal's fur with her small hand. The dog tenses up, ears perked, gaze fixed on the jurors. Without a sound, a woman on the jury adjusts her bag under her chair. The strong smell of a broken vial spreads through the room, but what happens in the following seconds? No one there was prepared to see it. Do you like stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now, back to our story. The courthouse was packed that Tuesday morning, every seat filled with residents of Millbrook, Connecticut, who had been following the case for weeks. The high walls and narrow windows cast long shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation. Natural light filtered through the aged glass, illuminating the witness stand where so many testimonies had been given over the past month. The tension was palpable, sustained by weeks of hearings filled with accusations and contradictory evidence that had split the small town right down the middle. Among the security personnel positioned throughout the courtroom, one figure stood out immediately. Officer Jake Morrison and his German Shepherd partner, Rex, maintained their position near the judge's bench. Rex was an impressive specimen, his black and tan coat gleaming under the courtroom lights, his intelligent brown eyes constantly scanning the room. The dog had been specially trained to detect various substances and had an uncanny ability to sense things that escaped human notice entirely. His presence had become routine during high-profile cases in Millbrook County, and today was no exception. The case at hand involved Thomas Whitfield, a respected businessman in his 50s who had built his reputation on fair dealings with local merchants and community involvement. For 3 decades, Whitfield had operated his import business, connecting small shop owners throughout Connecticut with suppliers across the country. His company, Whitfield Trading, had become synonymous with trust and reliability in the local business community. That reputation now hung in the balance as he faced allegations of financial misconduct that could destroy everything he had worked to build. The accusations centered around complex financial arrangements that allegedly favored larger clients at the expense of smaller merchants. Several local shop owners claimed they had been charged inflated prices, while bigger retailers received significant discounts for the same products. The case had divided the community between those who viewed Whitfield as a pillar of integrity and others who felt betrayed by someone they had trusted with their livelihoods. Judge Margaret Thornton, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, had been presiding over the case with her characteristic attention to detail. She had served on the bench for over 20 years and had seen her share of complex cases, but this one had tested even her considerable patience. The evidence presented had been confusing at times, with financial records that seemed to contradict each other and testimonies that painted vastly different pictures of the same events. As Judge Thornton organized the papers on her desk, preparing to call the next witness, a small commotion in the public seating area caught everyone's attention. 3-year-old Emma Rodriguez, dressed in a simple blue dress with tiny flowers, had slipped away from her mother's protective grasp. Her mother, Maria Rodriguez, owned a small bakery that had been one of the businesses affected by the alleged pricing discrepancies. Maria had been attending the hearings religiously, hoping to see justice served, but managing her energetic toddler in such a formal setting had proven challenging. Emma's steps were deliberate but unhurried as she made her way toward the front of the courtroom. Her curly brown hair bounced with each step, and her dark eyes were fixed on Rex with the kind of fascination that only a child could display. To her, the magnificent dog was far more interesting than any of the serious adult conversations happening around her. The sight of such a beautiful animal sitting so perfectly still was irresistible to someone who had grown up around the family's pet goldfish. Officer Morrison noticed the little girl approaching, but didn't immediately intervene. Rex was well trained and gentle with children, and the officer knew that sometimes these innocent interactions could actually help ease tension in stressful courtroom environments. He kept a careful eye on both Emma and his partner, ready to step in if necessary. Emma reached out with her small hand and gently touched Rex's fur, marveling at how soft it felt beneath her fingers. The gesture appeared innocent enough, just a child's natural curiosity about a beautiful animal. Rex had been petted by countless children during community events and school visits, and his temperament was known to be exceptionally patient and gentle. However, Rex's reaction this time was different from his usual calm acceptance of attention. His entire body tensed, his ears snapped to attention, and his gaze became laser-focused. But instead of looking at Thomas Whitfield, who sat at the defendant's table nervously adjusting his tie, Rex's attention was drawn to a specific point among the jury members. His training kicked in, and every instinct told him that something required investigation. The silence in the courtroom, already natural given the formal proceedings, seemed to deepen. Officer Morrison immediately noticed the change in his partner's behavior and tightened his grip on the leash, following Rex's unwavering gaze to see what had captured the dog's attention so completely. Among the 12 jury members, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchinson, a well-dressed woman in her mid-60s, suddenly seemed uncomfortable. She had been serving as a juror with apparent dedication, taking careful notes and asking thoughtful questions during deliberations. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, and she wore the kind of conservative business attire that commanded respect in professional settings. She had retired 2 years earlier from her position as head librarian at Millbrook Public Library and had seemed honored to serve her community in this capacity. Now, however, Mrs. Hutchinson's composure appeared to crack slightly. She shifted in her seat and casually moved her black leather handbag from her lap to the floor beside her chair, the movement so subtle that most observers wouldn't have noticed. But Rex's enhanced senses had detected something that made him want to investigate further, and his training told him to maintain focus on whatever had triggered his interest. Judge Thornton, with her years of experience reading courtroom dynamics, immediately sensed that something significant was happening. She had learned to trust the instincts of law enforcement personnel and their partners, having seen too many cases where such observations led to important breakthroughs. "Everyone please remain in your seats," Judge Thornton announced, her voice carrying the authority that came with decades on the bench. "Officer Morrison, is there something we need to address?" Maria Rodriguez moved to retrieve her daughter, but Officer Morrison held up a gentle hand, indicating she should wait. Rex was now clearly indicating something specific, and protocol required that the situation be properly investigated. The dog's behavior was too pronounced to ignore, and Morrison had learned over their 5 years as partners to trust Rex's instincts completely. As Rex began to move slowly toward Mrs. Hutchinson's position, the juror's discomfort became more apparent. She fidgeted with her notepad and avoided making eye contact with anyone in the courtroom, behavior that was notably different from her previous composed demeanor throughout the trial. The courtroom held its collective breath as this unexpected drama unfolded, with Emma still standing innocently beside Rex, completely unaware that her simple gesture of petting a friendly dog had initiated a chain of events that would change the course of the entire proceeding. The small child looked around at all the serious faces, not understanding why everyone had suddenly become so quiet and tense. Rex moved with the measured precision that marked all his actions, each step deliberate as he approached Mrs. Hutchinson's. position in the jury box. Officer Morrison maintained a firm but comfortable grip on the leash, allowing his partner enough freedom to investigate while keeping the situation under control. The German shepherd's nostrils flared slightly as he tested the air, his training telling him to follow whatever scent had initially captured his attention when little Emma had made contact with him. Mrs. Hutchinson's breathing became more rapid, though she tried to maintain her composure. Her hands, which had been steadily taking notes throughout the proceedings, now trembled slightly as she placed her pen down on the small writing surface attached to her chair. The change in her demeanor was subtle but noticeable to those who had been observing the jury throughout the trial. She had always been one of the most attentive and engaged jurors, frequently nodding during testimonies and appearing to weigh each piece of evidence carefully. As Rex drew closer, Mrs. Hutchinson made a small adjustment to her position, shifting her weight slightly in the chair. The movement was minor, almost imperceptible, but it caused her handbag to slide from its position against the chair leg. The black leather bag tipped over, and a small glass vial rolled out onto the courtroom floor. The sound of the vial hitting the marble floor was barely audible, but in the tense silence of the courtroom, it seemed to echo like a gunshot. The glass container shattered upon impact, releasing a strong medicinal odor that immediately filled the air around the jury box. The scent was sharp and distinctive, unlike anything that belonged in a courtroom setting. Mrs. Hutchinson's face flushed red as she quickly bent to gather the broken pieces. "Oh my," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm so sorry. That was just my herbal remedy for anxiety. I've been taking it to help me stay calm during the trial. It's completely natural, made from valerian root and other herbs." Her explanation seemed reasonable enough on the surface. Many people did use herbal supplements to manage stress, and jury duty, especially in such a high-profile case, could certainly be anxiety-inducing. However, Rex's reaction suggested there was more to the story than a simple herbal remedy. The dog remained focused on Mrs. Hutchinson, his alert posture indicating that whatever he had detected was still present. Emma, who had been watching the entire scene with the wide-eyed curiosity that only a 3-year-old could possess, suddenly spoke up in her clear, innocent voice. "Mummy, that smell was on her hands too," she said, pointing at Mrs. Hutchinson. "When she was writing, I could smell it from way over there." The simple observation from the child sent a ripple of tension through the courtroom. Emma's statement suggested that the scent hadn't just come from the broken vial, but had been present on Mrs. Hutchinson throughout the proceedings. It was the kind of detail that an adult might have dismissed or forgotten, but children often notice things that escaped more sophisticated observers. Judge Thornton looked at the situation with growing concern. In her 20 years on the bench, she had learned to trust unusual occurrences that disrupted the normal flow of proceedings. Too often, these unexpected moments revealed important truths that might otherwise have remained hidden. "Mrs. Hutchinson," Judge Thornton said carefully, "I think it would be appropriate for us to take a brief recess while we address this situation properly. Officer Morrison, would you please escort Mrs. Hutchinson to the jury room where she can be examined by our medical personnel?" The request was phrased politely, but everyone in the courtroom understood it was not optional. Mrs. Hutchinson's face went pale as she realized the implications of what was happening. She had served as a juror with apparent integrity for weeks, and now that service was being called into question by the actions of a trained police dog and the innocent observation of a small child. "This is completely unnecessary," Mrs. Hutchinson protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "I've already explained what happened. It was just an herbal supplement that I use for stress management. Many people use such remedies, and there's nothing improper about it." However, her protests seemed to ring hollow given Rex's continued interest in her direction. The dog's training was extensive, and his accuracy rate was well documented. If he detected something significant, protocol required that it be thoroughly investigated, regardless of how inconvenient it might be for the proceedings. As Mrs. Hutchinson was escorted from the jury box, Rex's attention shifted dramatically. Instead of following the juror as she left the courtroom, the German Shepherd turned toward a different area entirely. His nose led him to a corner of the courtroom where a brown leather briefcase had been placed, seemingly forgotten among the various bags and coats that spectators had brought with them. Officer Morrison followed his partner's lead, knowing that Rex's behavior indicated something important. The briefcase appeared unremarkable at first glance, just another piece of luggage that someone had brought to the courthouse. However, its position in the corner suggested it had been deliberately placed there rather than casually set down. "Whose briefcase is this?" Judge Thornton asked, addressing the courtroom at large. Her question was met with silence as people looked around at each other, everyone seemingly denying ownership of the item. Rex sat down directly in front of the briefcase and looked up at Officer Morrison, giving the clear signal that indicated he had found what he was looking for. This behavior was unmistakable to anyone familiar with police dog protocols. Rex had detected something significant, and his training told him to alert his handler immediately. With Judge Thornton's permission, Officer Morrison carefully opened the briefcase. Inside, nestled among what appeared to be personal papers, were several documents that immediately caught his attention. These were not the kind of papers that a casual courtroom observer would typically carry. Instead, they appeared to be original financial records related to Whitfield Trading Company, documents that had supposedly been unavailable during the discovery phase of the trial. The documents were organized meticulously, with detailed spreadsheets showing pricing structures, customer agreements, and profit margins that painted a very different picture from what had been presented during the trial proceedings. Most significantly, these records showed that Thomas Whitfield had not been the sole decision-maker regarding the pricing discrepancies that formed the basis of the case against him. Judge Thornton examined the documents with growing amazement. The papers suggested that there had been another party involved in the business decisions that had led to the current legal proceedings. Moreover, these documents appeared to be original records that should have been part of the evidence presented during the trial, but had somehow been withheld from both the prosecution and the defense. As the implications of the discovery began to sink in, all eyes turned to the spectator section of the courtroom. Among the many people who had been attending the proceedings as interested observers sat Robert Hayes, a man in his early 40s who had been present at every session but had never identified himself as having any direct connection to the case. Mr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the attention of the courtroom focused on him. He was well dressed in an expensive suit, and his silver hair was styled in a way that suggested professional success. Until this moment, he had seemed like just another concerned citizen following a case that affected his community. Now, however, his presence took on a more sinister significance. Robert Hayes felt the weight of every gaze in the courtroom as silence stretched uncomfortably around him. For weeks, he had positioned himself as merely an interested observer, someone concerned about the welfare of small businesses in Millbrook. He had arrived early each day, choosing a seat in the back row where he could observe the proceedings, without drawing attention to himself. His carefully maintained cover as a concerned citizen was now unraveling in the most unexpected way possible. Judge Thornton studied the documents from the briefcase with increasing fascination. The financial records were incredibly detailed, showing transaction histories that went back several years. What made these documents particularly interesting was that they revealed patterns of decision-making that involved multiple parties, not just Thomas Whitfield, as had been assumed throughout the trial. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Thornton said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades getting to the truth. These documents were found in a briefcase that appears to have been placed in this courtroom. Since you seem to be the only person present who hasn't claimed ownership, I'm going to ask you directly, are these your documents? Hayes cleared his throat nervously, his composure beginning to crack under the pressure. He had spent considerable effort maintaining his facade as an uninvolved observer, but the discovery of the briefcase had shattered that carefully constructed image. Your Honor, I have no idea how those documents got there. I'm simply a concerned member of the community who has been following this case because it affects local businesses. However, his denial sounded hollow even to his own ears. The coincidence of the documents being discovered just as Mrs. Hutchinson's suspicious behavior had been exposed was too significant to ignore. Officer Morrison continued to watch both Rex and the courtroom dynamics, noting how Hayes's body language had changed dramatically since the briefcase had been opened. Emma, who had been quietly observing everything with the intense curiosity of a 3-year-old, suddenly tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered loudly enough for several people to hear, "that man smells like the lady's hands too." The innocent observation from the child created another moment of stunned silence in the courtroom. Emma's untrained but remarkably sensitive nose had apparently detected a connection that the adults had missed. Her comment suggested that both Mrs. Hutchinson and Robert Hayes had been exposed to the same substance that had been in the broken vial. Maria Rodriguez looked down at her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Emma had always been unusually observant for her age, often noticing details that adults overlooked. As a baker, Maria had trained her own senses to detect subtle differences in ingredients and aromas, and she had apparently passed some of that sensitivity onto her daughter. "Emma, sweetheart," Maria whispered, "are you sure about what you're saying?" The little girl nodded seriously. "Yes, Mommy, they smell the same, like when you use the cleaning stuff at the bakery, but different." Judge Thornton made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of the case. "Bailiff, please ensure that Mr. Hayes remains available for questioning. I want to examine these documents more thoroughly, and I believe we need to investigate the possible connection between Mr. Hayes and Mrs. Hutchinson." The bailiff, Deputy Sarah Collins, moved toward Hayes's position with professional efficiency. She had been working in the courthouse for over a decade and had seen many cases take unexpected turns, but this situation was unusual, even by her standards. The combination of a police dog's detection abilities and a child's innocent observations had uncovered something that might have remained hidden indefinitely. As the courtroom began to buzz with whispered conversations, Thomas Whitfield sat at the defendant's table with growing amazement. For weeks, he had maintained his innocence while watching his reputation and business relationships crumble under the weight of accusations he couldn't fully understand. The emergence of these new documents suggested that there might be explanations for the pricing discrepancies that had nothing to do with intentional wrongdoing on his part. Whitfield's attorney, Jennifer Patterson, quickly began examining the newly discovered documents. Patterson was a sharp litigator in her 30s who had built her practice on defending small business owners against corporate litigation. She had taken Whitfield's case because she believed in his innocence, but even she had been puzzled by some of the financial irregularities that had emerged during the trial. "Your Honor," Patterson said, rising to address the court, "these documents appear to show a completely different structure for decision-making within Whitfield Trading Company than what has been presented during this trial. If these are authentic, they suggest that my client was not the sole person responsible for the pricing decisions that form the basis of this case. The documents revealed a complex web of partnerships and agreements that had been carefully hidden from view. Robert Hayes, it appeared, had been more than just a casual observer of Whitfield Trading Company. The financial records suggested that he had been a silent partner in several key decisions, particularly those involving the pricing structures that had disadvantaged smaller merchants. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Among the papers in the briefcase was a series of correspondence between Hayes and Mrs. Hutchinson that dated back several months before her selection as a juror. The letters discussed strategies for influencing the outcome of the trial, including detailed plans for how Mrs. Hutchinson could use her position on the jury to ensure a guilty verdict against Whitfield. The correspondence revealed that Hayes had a significant financial interest in seeing Whitfield convicted. With Whitfield out of the picture, Hayes would be in position to take over the import business relationships that Whitfield had spent decades building. The pricing irregularities that had damaged Whitfield's reputation had apparently been orchestrated by Hayes himself, using his insider knowledge to create situations that would eventually lead to legal action. Mrs. Hutchinson, according to the letters, had been recruited to serve as Hayes's inside person on the jury. Her background as a respected community member and retired librarian made her an ideal candidate for jury service, and her position gave her significant influence over the deliberation process. The herbal remedy that had caused such a reaction from Rex was apparently a specially formulated substance designed to help her maintain composure while carrying out Hayes's plans. The scheme was elaborate and had been months in the making. Hayes had carefully positioned himself to benefit from Whitfield's downfall, while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement. The presence of Mrs. Hutchinson on the jury was the final piece of his plan, ensuring that the verdict would go against Whitfield regardless of the evidence presented. However, none of their careful planning had accounted for the presence of a trained police dog and an observant 3-year-old child. Rex's enhanced senses had detected the chemical signature of the special formulation that Mrs. Hutchinson had been using, while Emma's innocent observations had provided the human testimony needed to support the dog's findings. Judge Thornton studied the correspondence with growing anger. In her 20 years on the bench, she had seen many attempts to manipulate the justice system, but the deliberate corruption of a jury member was particularly egregious. The scheme represented a fundamental attack on the integrity of the legal process and the trust that communities placed in their judicial system. "This court will recess for the remainder of the day," Judge Thornton announced, her voice reflecting the gravity of the situation. "I want a full investigation of these documents and the relationship between Mr. Hayes and Mrs. Hutchinson. This case will not proceed until we have thoroughly examined this evidence and its implications for everything that has transpired during this trial." As the courtroom began to empty, Thomas Whitfield felt a mixture of relief and vindication washing over him. For the first time in months, he had hoped that his name and reputation might be cleared. The discovery of Hayes's involvement explained so many of the confusing aspects of the case that had never made sense to him. The emergency investigation that followed the courtroom discoveries moved with unprecedented speed. Detective Lisa Warren, a seasoned investigator with the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, had been called in to coordinate the inquiry into what was rapidly becoming one of the most complex cases of jury tampering the county had ever seen. Warren had 23 years of experience in law enforcement, and her reputation for thoroughness had made her the obvious choice to lead this sensitive investigation. Within hours of the courtroom revelations, Warren had assembled a team that included forensic accountants, handwriting experts, and digital forensics specialists. The documents found in Hayes's briefcase were subjected to every available form of analysis to confirm their authenticity and trace their origins. The correspondence between Hayes and Mrs. Hutchinson was examined for fingerprints, DNA evidence, and any other clues that might shed light on the full extent of their conspiracy. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hutchinson had been taken to Millbrook General Hospital for a comprehensive medical evaluation. The substance that had spilled from her vial was analyzed by the hospital's toxicology department, revealing a sophisticated blend of chemicals designed to alter behavior and reduce anxiety while maintaining mental clarity. It was not the simple herbal remedy she had claimed, but rather a custom formulation that would have required considerable knowledge of chemistry to create. Dr. Michael Stevens, the hospital's chief toxicologist, was fascinated by the complexity of the substance. "This isn't something you could pick up at a health food store," he explained to Detective Warren. "The combination of compounds suggests someone with advanced knowledge of pharmacology created this specifically to achieve certain behavioral effects. It would have kept Mrs. Hutchinson calm and focused while allowing her to function normally in high-stress situations." The implications of this discovery were staggering. It meant that Mrs. Hutchinson's ability to serve effectively as a juror had been chemically enhanced, giving her an unfair advantage in maintaining composure during deliberations while potentially influencing other jury members. The substance explained why she had seemed so consistently confident and persuasive during the jury selection process and throughout the trial. Back at the courthouse, security footage was being reviewed frame by frame to trace Hayes's movements. During the trial proceedings, the courthouse had installed a comprehensive security system 2 years earlier, and every entrance, hallway, and public area was monitored by high-definition cameras. What the investigators discovered painted a picture of careful planning and execution that had been months in the making. The footage revealed that Hayes and Mrs. Hutchinson had indeed met several times in the courthouse corridors, always during brief recesses when their interaction would seem casual and unremarkable. They had been careful to avoid prolonged contact and had never met in the same location twice. Their conversations appeared brief and social, exactly the kind of pleasant exchanges that would be expected between community members who recognized each other. However, enhanced audio analysis of the security recordings revealed that these seemingly innocent conversations contained coded language and subtle exchanges of information. Mrs. Hutchinson had been providing Hayes with detailed information about jury deliberations, including the attitudes and opinions of individual jurors. This intelligence had allowed Hayes to adjust his strategy and identify which aspects of the case needed additional support or clarification. The investigation also uncovered financial records showing that Mrs. Hutchinson had received several payments over the past 6 months, all carefully disguised as consulting fees for supposed library research services. The payments had been made through a shell company that traced back to Hayes's business interests, providing a clear financial motive for her cooperation in the scheme. Thomas Whitfield spent the afternoon in his attorney's office trying to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. For months, he had struggled to understand how his business practices could have been so misrepresented and why the evidence seemed to contradict his own memory of events. The discovery of Hayes's involvement finally provided answers to questions that had been troubling him since the accusations first surfaced. Thomas, his attorney Jennifer Patterson, explained, "These documents show that Hayes had access to your company's financial systems through a partnership agreement that you apparently signed without fully understanding its implications. He was able to manipulate pricing structures and create the appearance of discriminatory practices while actually benefiting from those very practices himself." The partnership agreement, buried deep in the discovered documents, revealed how Hayes had gradually gained influence over Whitfield Trading Company's operations. What Whitfield had believed to be a simple consulting arrangement had actually given Hayes significant control over pricing decisions and customer relationships. Hayes had used this access to create the very problems that had eventually led to the legal case against Whitfield. The scheme was breathtakingly audacious in its scope. Hayes had essentially manufactured the evidence that formed the basis of the case against Whitfield, then positioned himself to benefit both from Whitfield's downfall and from his own insider knowledge of how the jury would decide. With Mrs. Hutchinson's influence over the jury deliberations, Hayes could have ensured a guilty verdict while maintaining his cover as an innocent observer. Emma Rodriguez had become something of a celebrity in Millbrook, with news of her crucial role in exposing the conspiracy spreading quickly through the small community. Her mother, Maria, had been contacted by several local reporters who wanted to interview the 3-year-old who had helped uncover one of the most sophisticated jury tampering schemes in Connecticut history. Maria was protective of her daughter's privacy, but proud of the role Emma had played in ensuring justice was served. Emma has always been very observant, Maria told Detective Warren during her formal interview. At the bakery, she notices when ingredients smell different or when something isn't quite right with a recipe. I guess those same skills helped her notice things that adults missed in the courtroom. The investigation revealed that Hayes' scheme had implications far beyond the Whitfield case. The financial records suggested that he had been involved in similar manipulation of other business relationships throughout the region. Several other companies reported suspicious dealings with Hayes' consulting firm, and investigators began examining whether the Whitfield case was part of a larger pattern of corporate manipulation. Rex, the German shepherd whose detection abilities had initiated the entire chain of discoveries, had become something of a hero in his own right. Officer Morrison reflected on how his partner's training and instincts had uncovered a conspiracy that might have succeeded if not for the chance interaction with a curious 3-year-old girl. Rex has been involved in hundreds of cases over the years, Morrison explained to reporters, but I've never seen him react quite like he did in that courtroom. His training told him something was wrong, and he persisted until we found out what it was. The combination of his detection abilities and Emma's innocent observations created the perfect storm that exposed this entire scheme. As evening approached, the scope of the investigation continued to expand. Forensic accountants were tracing financial transactions that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of businesses. The conspiracy appeared to have been operating for years, with the Whitfield case representing just the most recent and ambitious attempt to manipulate the legal system for financial gain. Judge Thornton spent the evening reviewing precedents for cases involving jury tampering and conspiracy. The legal implications of what had been discovered would require careful consideration of how to proceed with the original case against Whitfield. The evidence suggested that not only was Whitfield innocent of the charges against him, but that he was actually a victim of the very conspiracy that had been designed to destroy his reputation and business. The community of Millbrook was reeling from the revelations. Many residents had trusted Hayes as a successful businessman and had respected Mrs. Hutchinson as a dedicated public servant. The discovery that both had been involved in such an elaborate deception had shaken the faith that many people had in their local institutions and leaders. However, there was also a sense of vindication for those who had supported Whitfield throughout the ordeal. His reputation as an honest businessman was being restored, and the community was beginning to understand that they had been manipulated by a sophisticated scheme designed to benefit Hayes at everyone else's expense. 3 days after the dramatic courtroom discoveries, the investigation had uncovered a web of deception that extended far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. Detective Warren's team had worked around the clock, following financial trails that led to bank accounts in multiple states and business relationships that painted a picture of systematic manipulation spanning several years. The breakthrough came when forensic accountants discovered that Hayes had been operating under multiple business identities, each designed to target different types of companies in different regions. His methods were always similar: establish a consulting relationship with a successful small business, gradually gain access to their operational systems, create problems that would damage their reputation, then position himself to benefit from their downfall. Whitfield Trading Company had been just one target in a much larger scheme. Hayes had simultaneously been working to undermine 3 other businesses in neighboring counties, each following the same pattern of insider manipulation, followed by legal action designed to destroy the target company's credibility and market position. Mrs. Hutchinson's role in the conspiracy was more extensive than initially realized. The investigation revealed that she had been Hayes's inside person, not just for the Whitfield case, but for 2 previous jury selections in neighboring counties. Her reputation as a respected community member and her background as a librarian had made her an ideal candidate for jury service, and Hayes had exploited that reputation to corrupt multiple legal proceedings. The custom chemical formulation that had enabled Mrs. Hutchinson to maintain her cover was traced to a private laboratory in Hartford, where Hayes had commissioned its creation under false pretenses. The laboratory owner, Dr. Patricia Coleman, was shocked to learn how her work had been misused. Mr. Hayes presented himself as a researcher, studying stress management techniques for public servants, Dr. Coleman explained to investigators. He claimed the formulation was for a study on helping jury members cope with the psychological pressure of high-profile cases. I never imagined it would be used to facilitate jury tampering. The revelation that Mrs. Hutchinson had been chemically enhanced during her jury service raised serious questions about the validity of not just the Whitfield trial, but 2 other cases in which she had served. Appeals processes were being initiated for those cases, and several people who had been found liable in civil proceedings were seeking to have their cases reopened based on the new evidence of jury corruption. Thomas Whitfield finally learned the full extent of how he had been manipulated. The partnership agreement that had given Hayes access to his business systems had been part of an elaborate setup. Hayes had approached Whitfield 2 years earlier, presenting himself as a successful consultant who could help expand Whitfield Trading Company's reach into new markets. I thought I was getting help from someone who understood the import business, Whitfield explained to Detective Warren. Robert seemed knowledgeable and well-connected. He convinced me that his consulting services would help me compete with larger companies. I never realized he was actually working to destroy my business from the inside. The evidence showed that Hayes had used his access to Whitfield's systems to create the pricing irregularities that had damaged relationships with smaller merchants. He had systematically favored larger clients while inflating prices for smaller customers, creating the appearance that Whitfield was engaging in discriminatory business practices. All the while, Hayes had been documenting these irregularities as evidence for the eventual legal case that would destroy Whitfield's reputation. The most shocking discovery came when investigators found evidence that Hayes had been secretly recording conversations with Whitfield, editing them to create false impressions of discriminatory intent. These edited recordings had been provided to the attorneys representing the affected merchants, giving them evidence that seemed to support their case against Whitfield while actually being completely fabricated. Emma Rodriguez had become a local celebrity, with her role in exposing the conspiracy making her famous throughout Connecticut. Local television stations had featured stories about the 3-year-old whose keen sense of smell had helped uncover one of the most sophisticated cases of jury tampering in state history. Her mother, Maria, had been careful to protect Emma from too much media attention while still acknowledging her daughter's important contribution to justice. The Millbrook community had rallied around the Rodriguez family, with many people stopping by Maria's bakery to express their gratitude and support. Emma seemed largely unaware of her celebrity status, more interested in playing with her toys than understanding the significant impact her innocent observations had made on so many lives. Officer Morrison and Rex had also received considerable recognition for their role in the investigation. The police department was using their success as an example of how important it was to trust the instincts of trained animals and to take seriously any unusual behavior they exhibited during official duties. Rex's training saved this case, Morrison reflected during a department briefing. If he hadn't reacted to whatever he detected when Emma petted him, we might never have discovered any of this. It shows how important it is to pay attention to all the tools at our disposal, even when the signs are subtle. The legal implications of the conspiracy were still being sorted out. Judge Thornton had declared a mistrial in the Whitfield case, citing the impossibility of ensuring a fair outcome given the extent of the jury tampering. The charges against Whitfield were expected to be dropped entirely, with prosecutors acknowledging that he had been the victim rather than the perpetrator of the business practices that had led to the legal action. Hayes faced multiple charges related to fraud, conspiracy, and jury tampering. The evidence against him was overwhelming, with financial records, correspondence, and recorded conversations all pointing to his central role in orchestrating the scheme. His attorneys were reportedly exploring plea agreement options, recognizing that the volume of evidence made a successful defense unlikely. Mrs. Hutchinson had initially attempted to claim that she was also a victim of Hayes's manipulation, but the evidence of her financial compensation and her repeated involvement in multiple jury tampering schemes made that defense untenable. She faced charges related to jury tampering and conspiracy, with prosecutors emphasizing that her abuse of the public trust as a respected community member made her actions particularly egregious. The investigation had also revealed the extent to which Hayes had been planning to benefit from Whitfield's destruction. Financial documents showed that he had already negotiated agreements with several of Whitfield's major suppliers, positioning himself to take over those relationships once Whitfield's business collapsed. He had even secured financing for a new import business that would have directly competed with Whitfield Trading Company in the same markets. The scheme had been years in the making, and represented a level of planning and sophistication that impressed even experienced investigators. Hayes had created false identities, established shell companies, corrupted multiple legal proceedings, and manipulated financial systems, all in service of a plan to systematically destroy competitors while enriching himself. However, all of his careful planning had been undone by factors he could never have anticipated: the keen senses of a trained police dog and the innocent observations of a curious 3-year-old child. The combination of Rex's detection abilities and Emma's natural observational skills had created the perfect storm that exposed the entire conspiracy. As the investigation continued to expand, authorities were discovering that Hayes's scheme had affected far more people and businesses than initially realized. The full scope of the financial damage he had caused was still being calculated, but early estimates suggested that dozens of businesses and hundreds of individuals had been affected by his manipulations over the years. The case had become a landmark example of how sophisticated white-collar schemes could be uncovered through the most unexpected means. Law enforcement agencies throughout the region were reviewing their own procedures to ensure they were prepared to recognize and investigate similar conspiracies in the future. 6 months after the dramatic courtroom revelations, Millbrook had transformed from a community divided by suspicion into one united by a shared sense of justice served. The town square buzzed with activity on this crisp autumn morning as residents prepared for an event that would have been unimaginable during the dark days of the trial. A celebration honoring those whose courage and intuition had exposed one of the most elaborate schemes in Connecticut legal history. Thomas Whitfield stood in his newly renovated office looking out at the bustling streets of downtown Millbrook. Whitfield Trading Company had not only survived the ordeal, but had emerged stronger than ever. Once the truth about Hayes' manipulation became public, suppliers and customers who had distanced themselves during the trial returned with renewed loyalty and respect. The business that had nearly been destroyed by false accusations was now thriving as never before. Mr. Whitfield, his assistant called from the doorway. "The presentation ceremony is about to begin. Are you ready?" Whitfield smiled, adjusting his tie with hands that no longer trembled with anxiety. The past 6 months had been a journey of vindication and renewal that had restored not just his business, but his faith in the justice system and his community. Today's ceremony would formally recognize the heroes whose actions had saved not just his reputation, but the integrity of Millbrook's legal system. In the courthouse that had been the scene of so much drama, Judge Thornton was preparing to preside over a very different kind of proceeding. The same courtroom that had witnessed the unraveling of Hayes' conspiracy would now host a ceremony honoring those whose vigilance had protected the community from further manipulation. The investigation had ultimately revealed that Hayes' scheme had affected over 40 businesses across 3 states, with financial damages estimated in the millions of dollars. His systematic corruption of legal proceedings had undermined public trust in institutions that formed the foundation of American democracy. But the exposure of his activities had also demonstrated the resilience of those institutions when good people stood up for truth and justice. Mrs. Hutchinson had eventually pleaded guilty to multiple charges related to jury tampering and conspiracy. During her sentencing hearing, she had broken down in tears, expressing genuine remorse for betraying the trust that her community had placed in her. She received a sentence of 18 months in minimum security prison, along with community service requirements that would help repair some of the damage her actions had caused. "I allowed my financial difficulties to cloud my judgment," she had told the court during her sentencing. "I betrayed everything I believed in and violated the trust of people who respected me. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I did." Hayes had received a much harsher sentence, 7 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and jury tampering across multiple jurisdictions. The judge had emphasized that his systematic corruption of legal proceedings represented an attack on the very foundations of American justice. His assets had been seized to provide restitution to the businesses and individuals he had harmed. But today's ceremony was not about punishment for the guilty. It was about celebrating the heroes whose actions had protected their community. Emma Rodriguez, now 3.5 years old, sat in the front row wearing a beautiful blue dress that matched her bright, curious eyes. She clutched a small bouquet of flowers and looked around the courtroom with the same intense observation that had proven so crucial 6 months earlier. Maria Rodriguez sat beside her daughter, tears of pride streaming down her face. The single mother who had worked tirelessly to build her bakery business while raising Emma alone had never imagined that her daughter would become a symbol of justice and truth. The community's support during the past months had been overwhelming, with customers lining up at her bakery to show their appreciation for Emma's role in exposing the conspiracy. Officer Morrison and Rex occupied their familiar position near the judge's bench. Rex wore a special collar that had been presented to him by the Connecticut Police Dogs Association in recognition of his exceptional service. The German Shepherd maintained his professional composure, but his tail wagged slightly as he sensed the positive emotions filling the courtroom. Judge Thornton called the ceremony to order, her voice carrying the warmth and dignity that had made her a respected figure in Millbrook for over 2 decades. We gather today not to relitigate the past, but to celebrate the future and to honor those whose courage and integrity protected our community from a threat that could have destroyed our faith in justice itself. The first recognition went to Emma Rodriguez, whose innocent observations had provided the human testimony needed to support Rex's detection work. Judge Thornton knelt down to Emma's level, speaking gently to the little girl who had become a symbol of truth and innocence. Emma, your honesty and observation helped save our community. You showed us that truth comes from the most unexpected places and that even the smallest voice can make the biggest difference. Emma accepted a small golden medal with her name engraved on it, looking up at Judge Thornton with the serious expression that adults had learned to respect. "Judge Lady," she said in her clear, sweet voice, "I just told the truth like Mommy taught me." The courtroom erupted in warm applause and laughter at Emma's simple but profound statement. In a case that had involved sophisticated schemes and complex manipulations, a child's commitment to telling the truth had been the key to exposing the elaborate deception. Rex received recognition from the Connecticut Canine Officers Association, with Officer Morrison accepting the award on his partner's behalf. Rex represents the best of what police dogs can contribute to law enforcement, Morrison said. His training and instincts uncovered evidence that might have remained hidden forever. He reminds us that justice often comes from paying attention to details that others might miss. Thomas Whitfield was recognized not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience and integrity. Despite facing months of accusations and public scrutiny, he had maintained his dignity and cooperation with investigators, helping to expose the truth, even when it was painful to acknowledge how thoroughly he had been manipulated. Thomas Whitfield represents what we hope to see in all members of our business community, Judge Thornton said. When faced with false accusations, he didn't respond with anger or revenge. Instead, he helped investigators find the truth, even when that truth revealed how naive he had been about the people he trusted. Whitfield's emotional response surprised even himself. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I couldn't understand how my business practices had been so misrepresented, and I feared that my reputation would never recover. Today, I realize that this ordeal, as painful as it was, actually strengthened my relationships with my real friends and customers. It taught me to value integrity over profit and community over competition. Detective Warren received recognition for her thorough and professional investigation that had uncovered the full scope of Hayes's conspiracy. Her work had not only brought justice to Millbrook, but had helped other communities identify and prosecute similar schemes that might otherwise have continued undetected. This case reminded me why I became a police officer, Warren told the audience. Sometimes justice comes from high-tech forensics and complex investigations, but sometimes it comes from a child telling the truth and a dog doing what it was trained to do. The best investigations combine all of these elements. The ceremony concluded with Judge Thornton's reflection on the lessons learned from the entire experience. This case taught us that our democracy and our justice system are only as strong as the vigilance of ordinary citizens. Emma Rodriguez, Officer Morrison, Rex, Detective Warren, and Thomas Whitfield all played crucial roles in protecting our community from those who would corrupt our institutions for personal gain. She paused, looking around the packed courtroom at faces that reflected hope, pride, and renewed faith in their community. But perhaps most importantly, this case reminded us that truth has a way of emerging even when powerful people try to suppress it. A 3-year-old child and a trained police dog proved more powerful than all of Robert Hayes' schemes and manipulations. As the ceremony ended and people began to leave the courtroom, Emma tugged on her mother's hand. "Mummy, can we go see Rex?" Maria smiled and led her daughter over to where Officer Morrison was accepting congratulations from well-wishers. Rex immediately recognized Emma, and his tail began wagging enthusiastically as she approached. "Hi, Rex," Emma said, gently petting the dog who had become her unlikely partner in uncovering the truth. "You did a good job." Officer Morrison smiled as he watched the interaction between the child and his canine partner. "Emma, Rex wants me to tell you that he couldn't have done it without your help. You two make a great team." The celebration moved outside to the town square, where local businesses had set up booths offering food and entertainment. Maria's bakery had prepared special cookies decorated with images of police dogs and scales of justice, and the entire community came together to celebrate not just the resolution of a complex case, but the resilience and integrity that had seen them through a challenging time. As the sun set over Millbrook, Thomas Whitfield found himself standing with Maria Rodriguez, watching Emma play with other children in the town square. The little girl who had helped save his reputation was now just being a normal 3-year-old, running and laughing with friends who didn't know or care about her role in exposing a major conspiracy. "She doesn't really understand what she did, does she?" Whitfield asked. Maria shook her head, smiling. "She just knows that she told the truth and that people were happy about it. Maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that doing the right thing doesn't have to be complicated." As families began heading home and the celebration wound down, the people of Millbrook carried with them a renewed appreciation for the power of truth, the importance of vigilance, and the extraordinary impact that ordinary people could have when they chose to stand up for what was right. The case that had begun with a business dispute and evolved into a complex conspiracy had ultimately become a story of hope, redemption, and the triumph of truth over deception. In a small Connecticut town, a curious child, a trained police dog, and a community that refused to give up on justice had proven that even the most sophisticated schemes could not withstand the power of honesty and integrity. Dear listeners, we hope that Emma's and Rex's incredible story of truth and justice has touched your hearts. This tale reminds us that heroes come in all sizes, from a 3-year-old girl with keen observation to a dedicated police dog whose training saved an entire community. To continue this emotional journey with us, we've prepared a special playlist filled with equally captivating stories of courage and redemption. You can find it by clicking to your left. If this story moved you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of human nature and the power of truth. Don't miss our upcoming content. We're waiting for you in the comments section.